As more time passes, you are really confused. The good day, bad day cycle begins. You justify, you rationalize, you want it to work. You doubt yourself, you become anxious, you doubt reality, you start feeling messy, helpless, and powerless. Let's take on today's topic. And it's a question that somebody asked me, which is, how do we stop giving in to this damned cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is such a bear, right? So let me play this out for you. Let's pretend this is your journal, right? You're in a narcissistic relationship. You had a great weekend. Fun, beach, dinner, sex. You were wrong. Screw you, Dr. Ramani. I'm unsubscribing from her YouTube channel when I get home. My person was just having a moment. This isn't narcissism. Oh, no, it's Tuesday. Rage, gaslight, blame shift, contempt, manipulate. Oh, yeah. Okay, I get it. They had a tough meeting on Monday. Of course they're stressed after such a great weekend and, the buzzkill of their boss who's such an ass. I get it. Oh, look, we had a good dinner on Wednesday. Wow, they're so mad at me because my sister dropped by on Thursday. Oh, I hope we have another great weekend. I will make sure we have a great weekend. I will be perfect. I'll set it all up. They're just angry because they had a bad week. I get it. I would be saying these things too. I would be the same way too. Would ya? Would you be the same way? Just trying to say what you need to say to make the pieces fit, and that is cognitive dissonance, the fancy technical term for the mind F word that is the narcissistic relationship, as we ricochet between love story and horror show. Anyone watching this channel, almost all of you, are experts on cognitive dissonance, that idea that we're naturally driven to make things fit in our mind, right? We want this thing called congruence. We justify and rationalize so that we're not confused, and all of this justifying is driven by emotion, something we call motivated reasoning. We want a certain outcome. We want to be in the fun relationship. We want to be part of a family. Emotion drives our reasoning, and that may override rationality or the data in front of us, so we try to ignore those pieces we don't like, or we make up a story that makes the pieces fit, just like the fox and the sour grapes. Why do we do this? Because our brains don't like things that are inconsistent. It's sort of uncomfortable, like a little stone in your shoe. Now, I've talked about this on this channel, and in my new healing program, it has become so clear to me how much this impedes healing, cognitive dissonance, how much people struggle with the inconsistency created by these relationships and get stuck because they're trying to make everything fit. So here's a thought. How about you don't try to make it fit? It certainly goes against what our brains like, which is consistency. But what about getting comfortable with dissonance? So, some examples. I am married to someone and they lie to me and they treat me badly. I just had a good weekend with someone who is emotionally inconsistent and manipulative. My mother is cold and unavailable and cruel, and I love her. My son is manipulative and takes advantage of us, and he's my little baby. Now imagine saying those things, not easy to do, instead of saying, I'm married to someone and sometimes they aren't perfect because they watch their father lie and cheat, but really, who is perfect? Or, we had a great weekend. I know, he's a handful, right? But he's only a handful right now because his boss is such a jerk. Or, my mother always did her best and she always made many sacrifices for us. Or, well, we overindulged our son. It's my fault because I worked all the time and I just didn't make enough time for him. You see the difference? In the second set of statements, you blame you for another person's bad behavior. You can see how that becomes a slippery slope for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Does seeing it clearly and pushing beyond and being comfortable with the dissonance magically solve everything? No. But it means that you are now having to sort of see the ickiness of it You square up with it. You don't get to live in denial or talk yourself into the relationship. You have to see it clearly. You are uncomfortable. In fact, so uncomfortable that some people find the false narrative of the justification obviously much more comfortable. But that means, to have that false narrative means that you're constantly being bombarded with confusion and self-blame. These aren't appealing choices, right? If you fall into the justifications that the cognitive dissonance pulls for you, then you self-blame. If you lay it out clearly, you don't justify, but you may feel like a masochist for staying in it, which is another form of self-blame to see it that way, or you see it for what it is and may be able to get to radical acceptance, even if you stay in the relationship. Now, I'm a bigger fan, obviously, because I want everyone to heal. I'm a bigger fan of seeing it clearly and not justifying it. I am stunned when I see how much justification happens out there. I know some of it is driven by empathy. You really do see that someone had a rough start in childhood and that was a driver in developing their personality, or they've fallen on hard times. But then you can play that out as a reality or as a truth rather than as a justification. You can say, yeah, they came from a really bad family and their behavior is still unacceptable. And you can see that their behavior is not okay. So we could try it this way. My mother is cold and invalidating. She had a tough childhood. I love her, and her behavior is not okay. We had a great weekend. Yeah, he has a rageful dad who always yelled, and it was all terrible, and their behavior is mean, and it's not okay. You can build your justification in as a statement rather than letting them get away with it. And now you can practice that last phrase. And this behavior is not okay. That you can say it, you can even justify it, but you got to call it out as not okay. Someone manipulating, gaslighting, yelling, raging, threatening, it's not okay. Building the story out this way can sometimes help you slowly get to a place of seeing it, naming it, not blaming yourself, and not getting stuck in the endless cycle. Over time, if you can do this, you may get better at boundaries or simply at getting out or disengaging, or at a minimum, not blaming yourself. Cognitive dissonance is second nature. I am basically asking you to do the equivalent of hold back a sneeze. Not easy to do, but the only way we heal or grow is by being uncomfortable. Irritation is what grows a pearl. Being okay with discomfort. Being okay with discomfort may be what gets you your life back. Give it a shot. Not easy to do, but give it a shot. Let me just open with this. You know how many people, stay in narcissistic relationships because you think, damn it, I've already put 15 years or 5 years or 10 years or however much time you've put into this relationship. I've put my youth into this relationship. I've put the best of myself into this relationship. I moved across the country for this relationship. And as a result of that, no matter how toxic it is, you stay. But that doesn't really make sense, does it? You can't get the 5 or the 10 or the 15 years back by staying, but yet you stay for that reason. Here's another example. Different kind of example. You prepaid a non-refundable few $100s for a hotel room for a weekend break. Ahead of that, you are having the week from hell, and then you get sick. The weather shifts, and what should have been a sunny weekend is now going to be rainy and not the best getaway. The pressures at work and home have really started making you sicker, and a weekend in bed at home would do wonders for you, especially since you'll have another tough week the week after. You really don't want to go away and drive 3 hours to sit in the rain. The drive will be exhausting, but you still go. Why? For the same reason folks stay in narcissistic relationships, even when they know they're toxic. It's partly because of something called the sunk cost fallacy, which may be at play here. Once we invest in something, time, money, we often just go along with it, even when it is no longer a good thing to do. Sunk costs are resources we cannot get back. The hotel room, for example, was non-refundable. But this can apply to anything where we can't get what we put in back. So going on that ill-timed trip or doing something that is not a good use of our time will not get that time and money back. However, it is possible that it may result in us getting sicker, not having a good time, wasting more time, or wasting even more money eating out and on various activities on a trip that is actually not good for us, but you're doing so you don't lose the couple $100s. But let me repeat, you cannot get the money back whether you go or not. At the time you made the call to go on the trip, it seemed like a good idea. Now it's not. You not going doesn't get the money back, right? But the fact is, we don't like losing stuff. That's something called loss aversion. It just feels awful. So we may make further bad decisions to avoid that discomfort around losing money or time. So we may do something even when it's not good for us to avoid that sense of loss. So this idea of bad decision making because of things like sunk cost fallacies and loss aversion, they all derive from the world of behavioral economics. Now, alas, we are not computers. We are people who have emotions, and emotions really tinge our decision making. We rationally know that skipping out on the rainy, time-consuming, exhausting weekend is probably the best course of action, but then we also have to sit with the discomfort of wasting the money. There is a cognitive dissonance element here. We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. And for many people, getting what they paid for seems like it will smooth things out, even though it ends up becoming a bad way to spend time and you were going to lose the money either way. Economic theory, which is supposed to be more devoid of messy emotion, would have it that we should be using future gains and losses to guide our decisions and not the money that we've already sunk in. If we can do that, we may be less likely to make bad choices, but the fact is, it's not so easy to do. Turns out that negative emotions like anxiety also don't help. And in one study by Dijkstra and colleagues, they found that those negative emotions were sort of associated with kind of getting stuck and not taking action and getting stuck in the sunk cost, basically continuing to stay in the bad investment, going on the rainy weekend, staying in the toxic relationship. So what does this have to do with narcissistic relationships? Kind of everything. So you're in a narcissistic relationship, right? Let's use a romantic one as an example. You met someone charming, fun, attractive, charismatic, successful. You have fun. You really are growing to like them and them you, and you want to finally really settle into a committed relationship. They want to move in, so you do. You're hoping to get married. It's been 3 years. They aren't really moving in that direction. You want a family too. You're committed to each other, but they're not interested in that. And on top of that, they're really dismissive, manipulative, gaslighty, unkind, critical, and angry. They keep putting you off, saying, we'll get to it, we're good now. It's 3 years. You can't get the 3 years back. So you stay in. And you keep staying in. And they keep moving the goalposts. Yeah, we'll do that down the line. I'm too busy right now. I need more stability. I need to get promoted. Like, why are you rushing me? On and on. Another year goes by. 4 years in. 4 years. I can't walk away, start again. 4 years? Can't get the 4 years back. 5 years. Still don't have kids. Shit, you want kids. Okay, maybe we won't get married. We'll have kids. That's not how you pictured it. Nah, I don't think they want to have kids. 6 years. The loss aversion in many narcissistic relationships is around time. There are other researchers in the past like Rustbolt who called this the investment model of relationships. But it's a bad investment, just like that weekend away, or a bad business investment, or a project that is running into cost overruns and will never give return on investment. But maybe $50 million has already been sunk into it, and so people just keep throwing more money into it. Emotion takes over. I can't get those 6 years back. I am going to effing make this work. You stay. And maybe with enough time you end up getting married or having those children. Now, You're in a relationship, a toxic relationship with someone, and you got kids. Was it a great investment? Were the 6 years wasted or not? It's challenging. Now, most narcissistic relationships of choice, for example, intimate relationships, friendships, workplace relationships, are driven by the sunk cost fallacy, wanting to not walk away from all that time and resource, which is why I am such a big fan of people getting out early when the red flags begin to show up. There's fewer sunk costs at that moment. It all relates to cognitive dissonance, of course, but also that loss aversion. Then you have the confusion of not knowing what this is. Charm and charisma feel so good, so you want this to work. They are attractive, so you want this to work. You want a fun sidekick friend who's just so cool to spend time with. You want this to work. You always wanted to work for this great company, so you want this to work. The idea of walking away after the time and sometimes the money, well, that point, that's what messes up the decision making. Behavioral economists would say that the future gains and losses, they do need to guide us if we're going to do this decision making right. Now, looking realistically at the long game, not only is that really hard to do when emotion is involved, and that right there is why this YouTube channel exists. Because when it comes to narcissistic relationships, the long game is bad. Putting more and more resources into a narcissistic relationship is like betting on an investment on VCRs making a comeback. Not a good place to park your money. And in a way, there is so much less ambiguity in a narcissistic relationship because they're always going to be unhealthy. Even if the early period was fun, the love bombing period of the relationship was also unhealthy. So you got to make your investment decisions accordingly. So even if you invested heavily in that VCR company, it may have seemed like a good idea at the time in the 1980s. It's not anymore. You can't get the other money back. Spending more money doesn't really make sense. The narcissistic relationship seemed like a good idea during the love bombing phase. Now that you are in devalue and discard, not so much. And you can't get the time back by throwing more time at it. The future will always be more of the same in narcissistic relationships. Another interesting bit of guidance we get from behavioral economics is to break this all down, this decision making, into phases. And I like this because it's a place for you to almost become more self-forgiving in your decision making in this kind of a relationship. The sunk cost fallacy is us not accounting for the idea that we cannot get the money or time back. So putting more money and time into it, while it may feel comforting, it doesn't make sense. Like I said, even though it's uncomfortable to let that original investment go. But when we break it into phases, we can assess whether the investment makes sense at each phase. So when we apply this thinking to a narcissistic relationship, it can look like this. Love bombing phase? Seems like a great idea. Putting the time in, putting the investment in, you're loving the ride, you get swept away. It makes sense you would invest time into it then. Even though my hope for the world is that everyone will eventually see love bombing as bad, which I know is a tough sell. So even then, during love bombing, I'd still love to see people sort of hedge their investments. Now you move into the red flags and devaluing phase of the relationship. At this point, you're still investing on the basis of the love bombing phase, right? But some of the blush is off the rose. So this may be when you should start pulling back on the investment a little. But sadly, and this is where it gets interesting, this is exactly when people start doubling the time and investment they make in a narcissistic relationship because a narcissistic person's starting to pull back. In the discard and the future faking and manipulation phase, at this point is really when the sunk cost fallacy really gets us. Because on the basis of what is happening in front of you, this is a good time to say, no thanks. Yes, you did put in the time. Can't get the time back. At this phase, it is no longer a good investment. This right here is the money shot. No pun intended. This is no longer a good play in terms of an investment. As Dykman's research suggests, Negative emotions make sunk costs worse. We are often less likely to take action when we feel negative emotions such as anxiety. And unfortunately, that is a key part of the fallout of narcissistic abuse. When we are in the sadness and confusion and anxiety that come from narcissistic abuse, we aren't good at thinking clearly and rationally about how to invest our time, which is precisely when we will keep throwing the good money after bad, as it were. I think one place where behavioral economics research hasn't, I think, sufficiently shown a light is on the fear of regret. Maybe they just put that in with the negative emotions. Fear of regret is an emotion that really muddies the waters for survivors of narcissistic abuse. It still relates to the sunk cost, because not only is there the sense of wasting more time and resource you can't get back, there's also the fear of regret in these narcissistic relationships, that if you don't keep trying, what if you're wrong? What if you walk away from something that actually was good? You're not. You probably aren't wrong. Again, it doesn't mean you have to leave. I'm never going to pressure anyone to leave, but probably it's time to stop bringing your A game to the narcissistic relationship. Pulling back resource means giving the best of yourself to yourself, or to worthy and reciprocal recipients, and not to the narcissist. It means saying, ugh, I will swallow the $200 on the lost hotel room, and then recognizing how good you will feel after a few days of rest. Maybe the resolution of the sunk cost fallacy is radical acceptance. You can't get it back. That's that. And you can still win, though, by not wasting more money, time, or resources. The sunk cost fallacy is a simple sort of a model that cuts to the chase on many of the struggles of people who waste a lot of time in narcissistic relationships. You can't get the time back, but maybe you learn something. And to me, that is a return on investment. So, let's say I came into your house with a can of paint and I just spilled it and threw it at the walls and made a huge mess. And then I upended the furniture, I blocked up your sinks, I smashed your windows, and I sliced up your sofas. And then I came back and I offered to clean it up. Most of you would think, get the hell out of my house. You're the one who messed it up. I am calling the police. And yet, in narcissistic relationships, this is a classical trauma-bonded dynamic. The narcissistic person comes into your life, makes a mess of it, kind of offers to clean it up, and people let them come back in and say, sure, come help me clean up the mess that you made of my life. So how the hell does that work? Well, let's start with first. Sometimes that's where the narcissistic relationship can actually start. When we have talked about the different kinds of people who are often the more likely targets of narcissistic relationships, that can include people who have had a history of trauma or significant loss, or people who are going through a difficult or a transitional time. At those times, we feel messy and unsettled and almost like we need someone to clean things up for us, right? It's exactly the kind of situation a person with a narcissistic personality may try to exploit. They may sweep in and as part of love bombing may offer help or support, may give advice or guidance as they clean up our perceived messiness. They may tell us, oh, you're so lovable despite whatever messes we are enduring. This is the stuff that would often happen early in a relationship. And while it is dangerous because it sets up a dynamic of them as the savior and the other person in the relationship as in need of saving, this other dynamic I'm about to talk about is a much bigger problem. Psychologically speaking, a narcissistic person is a one-person wrecking crew. They slowly dismantle us and often prey upon people who have their own attachment issues. So when the narcissistic person who is manipulative comes into contact with someone who has, let's say, an anxious attachment style, that becomes a recipe for a trauma-bonded catastrophe. The cycle of love bomb, calm, chaos, break up, get back together, calm, chaos, break up, get back together. That's a classical trauma bonded cycle and a classical sort of anxious attachment cycle. But with each one of those cycles, you are being increasingly invalidated, gaslighted, manipulated, and end up feeling more and more confused, helpless, self-blaming, self-doubting, anxious, and upside down. You basically feel like a mess, right? And that works beautifully for the narcissistic person because you look externally like the messier one. They are actually soothed by you being off balance, and they can become quite calm and composed under those conditions, and may even appear to be soothing you. Oh, babe, I know you're going through a hard time. I got you. You just got to do some work on yourself. So then, in response to that, now you go into therapy because you're the one who is the mess, right? And they are soothing you. But it was a mess that this relationship made. Lots of people will say, you know what? I was actually doing okay in my life when I met this narcissistic person. Sure, I had my demons and my wounds, but I was doing fine. I thought I met this person. We had a good thing. It was fun. They were smart or sexy or compelling or whatever charismatic, scrumptious, narcissistic thing they were. And then as they do, around the 2-month mark, the cracks slowly appear, the red flags, you justify, the usual drill. As more time passes, you are really confused. The good day, bad day cycle begins. You justify, you rationalize, you want it to work. You doubt yourself, you become anxious, you doubt reality, you start feeling messy, helpless, and powerless. And then the narcissist may say things like, damn, your anxiety is really stressing me out. Or you may find yourself feeling more and more suspicious and feel like a private eye staking out their social media or watching their rhythms because something about them feels shady and you feel like you're losing your mind. Or you find that you get so preoccupied and that gets in the way of work or school. And you start getting more and more isolated because you're getting lost in the vortex of the relationship. And that gets dangerous because what might be happening now is you're getting pulled away from your supports, which is the only thing stopping you from being gaslighted. As you start feeling messier, it becomes easier for the narcissistic person to sort of play with you, cat and mouse style, to hoover you. You start to believe that, oh, this is my person and I'm the one who's a mess and that you have to make it work. You bargain with yourself. You focus on the idea that someone else is going to get them who's not looking as sort of anxious as you, and that you're thinking, oh, I'm always going to be alone because I'm such a mess. And so when they do hoover, or perhaps as it feels like they're slipping away or you're in the discard phase, you may even start leaning into your identity as a mess. And aren't they wonderful for staying with you? And it's like they are doing you a favor by staying with you despite your so-called neurosis and your anxiety and your bad memory and your emotion or your drama. They make messes, then they sweep in and pretend to clean them up, and you believe that they are doing right by you. By understanding narcissistic abuse and what it does to you, you can identify this pattern, that you are the one who feels like the weak one, the messed up one, and that you run the trauma-bonded risk of subjugating yourself to needing to be rescued and allowing them back in to clean up the mess that they made. This doesn't only happen in intimate relationships. Families can do this too. Bring you into bad schemes or plans, invalidate, gaslight, manipulate, and confuse. You feel completely upside down, and then they come in and offer to fix it. The therapy world can play into this as well. Narcissistic folks can actually present really calmly and look really well put together in couples therapy. The charming narcissist sitting next to the rather upset, anxious, and wide-eyed other non-narcissistic person, unless the therapist knows what they are looking at, it can be easily framed as, well, let's work on this messy person's anxiety and get this relationship tidied up. That idea of fixing the other person, the survivor of the narcissistic abuse, and never addressing the manipulation and the personality of the person making the mess is a real problem that can occur in couples therapy. In a way, it's like an arsonist who sets a fire so he can pretend to be the hero and put it out. They're making a mess so they can be the fixer. Be aware of red flags and of what narcissistic abuse does to us, how it impairs our judgment, how it's not you. Really, it's them. And the worst thing you can do is allow the fixer to be the very one who broke it. You aren't broken after these relationships. You're confused. And I must say that if you understand narcissistic abuse, it's a big first step to unconfusing you. You aren't damaged after these relationships. Again, you're merely confused. And this is always worse if the confusion plays on your core wounds. But pay attention to this dynamic. Narcissistic abuse happens. You feel confused and anxious and self-doubting and self-blaming. You feel messy. And then the narcissistic person, especially during the Hoover, comes in and says, oh, let me take care of you. It seems like you're going through a tough time. In essence, they're offering to clean up your mess. But it's not your mess. It's a mess they created. And they're playing upon this diminished version of yourself, the loss of self-esteem that all survivors go through. If they made the mess, you'll clean it up. But please don't let them in to pretend to clean up the mess, because they're just going to make it worse. Hope dies last. Now, this proverb was actually sent in as an email by somebody who reported it was a German proverb or idiom. And they pointed out that this, hope dies last, is different than the more common English version that we use, and those of us who speak English as a primary language, of hope springs eternal. And they are right. That proverb of hope springs eternal actually has its origins in the writing of Alexander Pope. But I like this saying a little bit better, that hope dies last, because I think it cuts to the chase in a more useful way for understanding narcissism. So what does this saying, what does this proverb, hope dies last, mean for narcissism and narcissistic abuse? Like I said, it cuts to the chase of why people get stuck. I have often spoken about the key factors that keep people stuck in narcissistic relationships: fear, guilt, pity, lack of information, still loving the person, money, children, and hope. It is probably better to call it misplaced hope or unrealistic hope or misguided hope. But at the end of the day, it is hope. And what is the hope for? Hope for change. Hope that the promises will be kept. Hope that things could get better. Hope that the future fakes finally come true. In a narcissistic relationship, this saying could not have more truth. The fact is, a lot of people get stuck because hope indeed does die last. And there are lots of reasons for this. Trauma bonding means a complex life comprised of justifications and rationalizations and creating reasons to stay in the relationship. This is a pattern that often got set in childhood and can extend to adult relationships. Sometimes the people around you foster this sense of hope and tell you that they have seen this one or this difficult person change, and that to give up hope of change, well, that's just defeatist or negative. You end up getting sort of painted as a sort of negative Nelly if you suggest that things in a given situation just can't change. And if you spent an entire childhood hoping a parent would change, hoping that things would get better, then you know what it feels like to live in long-term hope, especially when it comes to toxic situations. There is a very human piece to this. To give up on hope can really feel like falling into the abyss, a bit like losing faith. It doesn't feel good. Hope keeps us going, and with the hope gone, then what? Because so many people in narcissistic relationships have completely lost faith in themselves, view themselves as being not enough, have lost their self-esteem. To lose hope in the relationship can, and having little faith in themselves, means that to lose hope really feels like falling into the abyss. It flies in the face of almost all world religious beliefs and traditions and of every feel-good motivational message you've ever seen. You're not supposed to give up on hope, right? So while hope does spring eternal and does die last in narcissistic relationships, it hangs by a thread throughout the relationship. In fact, that is the challenge of the narcissistic relationship. You will have multiple days when the hope fades more and more and more, and then one day the hope gets rejuvenated because you and the narcissist have a good day, a happy evening, a connected moment. Then hope gets on more firm footing, and the whole cycle begins again. There is that penny drop moment in all narcissistic relationships when the hope does die. It looks different in every relationship. Sometimes it happens when the ultimate betrayal of trust happens. I don't know, an infidelity, or they put a child in harm's way, or get arrested and destroy the family's finances. In those cases, the hope that was already teetering and fragile finally drops. Sometimes it is the behavior of the narcissist when you are sick. You assumed that even though they weren't good, useful in the day-to-day, when the rubber really met the road and life got serious and you got sick, you believed that they would actually finally appreciate you. At that point you realize they don't, and then hope dies. You believe that as they get older and you help them out and you take care of them, they will finally thank you and apologize for the pain they caused you and so many others throughout your life. Nope. And then the hope dies. It could be the day that their anger and rage continue to escalate and they finally lay hands on you or physically threaten you. Then the hope dies, but sadly, the hope does not die, even when there's physical violence in too many cases. So there is that moment. Sometimes people test the narcissist, wanting to keep hope alive. They will put conjectures to them. What if someday I got sick, or you only had a year to live, or something like that? The answer is usually pretty bleak. And then hope dies. It looks different in every case, but it tends to be the last thing to die in a narcissistic relationship. Lots of people will say they can't unsee what they saw in the relationship. There is a point where to go back feels like giving up on themselves. And in more than a few cases, some people stay even after hope has died. It happens. But maybe they stay with a more realistic assessment of the situation, realistic expectations, and radical acceptance. In a narcissistic relationship, this proverb, that hope dies last, is not a proverb. It almost feels like a truism. And in an ideal world, you will find hope in far better places than this narcissistic relationship, like places like yourself, and the good and respectful and reciprocal spaces in your life. So let's talk about helplessness. It can feel like no matter what you say in a narcissistic relationship, nothing ever gets better. No matter what you do in a narcissistic relationship, nothing gets better. And even if you went to a relatively dehumanized state and just gave it all up, you did everything they asked of you, gave up your sense of identity, your sense of meaning, and your sense of purpose, and the people and the experiences that matter to you. Not only does nothing change, I'd be willing to bet that sometimes it just gets worse. Anyone would feel helpless under those circumstances. So let me give you a little bit of research background to round this out, okay? In the 1970s, the psychologist Martin Seligman did a series of seminal studies on something called learned helplessness. And I just want to say something before I go further. I'm going to talk about a study that was conducted with animals, and the animals were a little uncomfortable in this research. And I want to let you know that in case that is going to make this hard for anyone to listen to. It's mild, but again, research suggests it was a minor discomfort to the dogs that were used as the research participants who didn't show long-term harm. But I do know that for some of you, it could be difficult to listen to. So I just wanted to give you that so you would, so you'd be prepared. Again, really no significant harm, but I wanted to give you that disclaimer. So let's talk about Seligman's research. A mini version of what he did was that he placed dogs in specially designed harnesses and boxes in a research lab. And he had a way to harness them into these sort of hanging, again, almost hanging hammocky harnesses so that their legs were hanging down. The dogs were able to use their heads to easily push at some panels that were right in front of them. The dogs started to learn that a light that would turn on meant that a light shock was going to come and be applied to their hind legs, which obviously they didn't like. It didn't feel good. For some of the dogs, they learned that they could stop the shock by hitting the little panels in front of their heads when the light came on. However, for the other dogs, when the light came on, even if they hit the panels, they couldn't stop the shocking. Okay? So you're with me. The moment the dogs with those panels in front of their heads touched either one, the shock would end. Okay? So you understand me so far, I hope. One group of dogs learned that they could end the shocks by pressing that panel with their head, and the other group of dogs could not stop the shocks, even if they pressed those little panels with their head. Okay? So, then the next day, he took the dogs, gave them a little rest, came back, took the dogs, and he put them in little boxes that had sort of like a half a wall partition, so they could jump over and go to the other part of the box or explore it if they wanted. He set it up so that when the lights went off, the floor under them on one side of the box would deliver a small shock. It didn't feel good, but they had the ability to jump over to the other side of the box where it was no longer shocky and they could be comfortable. So here's where this research gets really interesting. The dogs who had learned the day before that they could touch that panel with their head to stop the shock, it was really only those dogs that would jump over to the other side of the box to get away from the shock on the second day. The dogs for whom, when they hit the panel, it didn't matter, they got shocked no matter what the day before, those dogs didn't try to go to the other side and avoid the shock. They just sat on the shocky side of the box and kept getting the uncomfortable shocks. These findings persisted even a week later. Those dogs learned, they remembered that hitting the panel with their head would not stop a shock. Even a week later, they still wouldn't learn to go to the other side of the box where they could escape the light shock on their feet. So basically, even after just a brief learning trial, when they learned they could not stop something unpleasant in their environment, they generalized that learning. And what they did was they didn't even leave when they were uncomfortable, even when they could. Seligman called this phenomenon learned helplessness, a sort of basic learning that nothing that an animal can do, or a person, if they can't do anything to fix the situation, they stop trying pretty quickly and fall into an ineffectual passivity. Initially, the dogs did try to step away when they were in that harness and could move and move their heads, but they stopped trying. Seligman used learned helplessness as a way of understanding depression. Helplessness is a very common element of depression symptomatology. And many, many depressed people feel a sense of apathy. And apathy is that idea that you don't feel like doing anything because you're like, why bother? Why do anything? So you can see how that could leave a person who learns that nothing they do helps to just stop trying and get stuck, just like the dogs. Even when opportunities and options are put in front of the person, they think nothing will work or there's no point, so they sort of stay stuck in a situation that is at times harming them. Now you can also see how this paradigm is relevant to narcissistic abuse. Over years of this, whether you're from a narcissistic family or have a narcissistic partner or work with a narcissistic boss, you may learn, you do learn, that nothing you do helps. It's the same invalidating mess day after day. It's like Groundhog Day in hell. One day, you may decide to stop trying, or even when the opportunity is there, perhaps in another part of your life, to do something, to achieve something, to say something, you may not do it. Because as you have learned in the other primary parts of your life that are impacted by narcissistic abuse, you learn, what's the point? Why try? Seligman's initial experiment is particularly relevant to those of you from a narcissistic family of origin. Remember, the dogs first learned, when the panel wouldn't stop the shock, they learned that whatever they try doesn't matter. They're going to get shocked. And then, though, after they learned that, then they were given the opportunity to make it better and get away from the harm. They didn't. It's very similar with narcissistic families. Throughout your childhood, you learn that there's nothing you can do. Nothing you try works. And so that easily generalizes into adulthood. In a narcissistic family, helplessness is something that develops over a long childhood. Listen, those dogs only had to stay in those little boxes for a little while. You faced all of this for a lifetime. A lifetime in which nothing you did was enough, where you didn't get noticed, validated, supported, or loved, no matter what you did, no matter what you said. You weren't heard, no matter how you spoke. You weren't seen. And when you finally were heard or seen, at that point you were often gaslighted or invalidated or dismissed. And the difference between you as a child and Seligman's dogs is that in your childhood, you never felt like you were put in that box where you could go to the other side. Your harness wasn't released. There was no other side of the box to jump to. You were stuck in it, which only reinforced the sense of helplessness. Fast forward to adulthood, when, as one could argue, you were allowed to make more of your own choices. And what happens, you may likely have spun into yet another narcissistic relationship as an adult. And this time, in many cases, there were times you could have gotten out of the relationship, gotten to the other side of the box, as it were, but you didn't. That childhood, characterized by narcissistic abuse, those echoes waft into adulthood. And your helplessness really reflects a sense of stuckness, and sometimes even a helpless passivity, a why botherness of it all that lingers with you. And for people who are only now or recently learning about narcissistic abuse, after a lifetime of it, you didn't even recognize it as a thing before. You just assumed there was nothing you could do. You just had to sit there, just like those poor pups, and take the shocks. Helplessness is a major theme in adulthood narcissistic relationships. Often there is helplessness because a person doesn't know what they are dealing with. It takes people a minute to figure out that they are in a narcissistic relationship. But up until you do figure it out, the helplessness is building up day over day over day. That ongoing sense that there is nothing you can do, which is actually a feeling that can spin into depression, anxiety, and hopelessness. There are few feelings that are more destabilizing than helplessness. And it is such a classical part of the narcissistic abuse survivorship pattern. Part of helplessness is that idea that even if there is something I can do about this situation, I myself personally can't do it, or it's not going to work for me. I observe this very often in narcissistic marriages. Yes, for many people, divorce is an option. But for those with children, or perhaps financial issues, and maybe even other religious and cultural issues, it's really not an option. In the United States, at least, and I think in other parts of the world, the courts will divide custody of the children, and many people know that their narcissistic partner will not be up to managing the kids on their own, even though they'll try to fight for custody. So folks will sometimes white-knuckle themselves through the narcissistic marriage to shield their children from being with that other parent on their own, or at least to just be under the same roof as their kids 24/7. Again, there is a sense of helplessness that the courts do not and will not recognize narcissistic abuse. And basically, you're going to have to endure the narcissist's wrath until these children are adults. More of a sense of helplessness. Cultural issues can also play very heavily into helplessness. I am often reading, obviously when I can, the comments on videos and the many emails that we receive. Narcissistic abuse is not just a global phenomenon. What's interesting is that in certain parts of the world, it plays out with this sort of greater backdrop of helplessness. Existing structures such as involuntary marriage, limited rights for women or others who are otherwise socially disadvantaged, taboos against divorce, lack of resources or even penalties against those who perpetrate domestic abuse, societally normalized gender-based violence, all of these themes may mean that helplessness is likely even pronounced in other parts of the world. People in certain regions of the world who face restrictive cultural assumptions may be stuck in these narcissistic relationships with literally no possibility of escape. In the workplace, the same helplessness issues apply. It's kind of a sick hobby of mine. I study high-profile cases of predators, harassers, and generally bad people, like the Weinstein, Epstein types of folks. Bosses who were so powerful, so wealthy, and lived their lives in absolute impunity. But the things we learn from these tyrants apply even to us regular folks. Because listen, we regular folks need to earn a living. And the fact is, HR departments don't understand narcissistic abuse. People find there is often little recourse if this happens to them in the workplace. And in most workplaces, as in most of the world, the most powerful people prevail for all the reasons I listed. People can feel very helpless in workplace situations, toxic workplace situations, and they'll often feel stuck, especially if they're in a very narrow type of job. It's a visa situation. There's not a lot of jobs out there like the world right now, or they're employed at a time when there's just not enough jobs and there's lots of people lined up for those jobs. You feel like you have to endure the toxic situation. And helplessness is one of the last stops on the train before we careen into major depression. The challenge is that, as is suggested by this phenomenon of learned helplessness, some of this helplessness is actually in our head. There is another side of the box we could jump over. After years of being taught otherwise, and in many cases for people in narcissistic abuse, the cage is never opened. There is no other side of the box. The helplessness is real. And that, to me, is one of the most horrific things that can happen to a human being. And again, a classical part of narcissistic abuse. So what is a person supposed to do if they're feeling helpless? Number one, learn about narcissism. Watch my videos, watch everybody's videos, read books, just figure it out. Part of the helplessness is made worse by trying something over and over again, trying to be seen, trying to be heard, and constantly failing. Basically, of being the dog who can never stop the shocks by pressing the panel with his head. Stop trying. Stop. Work around the narcissist if you're stuck with them. Recognize that they're never going to listen. No, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good at all. But it may lift the helplessness in some ways. And I do acknowledge, if you are reliant on the narcissist for basic needs, that it can be very difficult to get away from the helplessness if you count on them for money, food, shelter, that sort of thing. Number 2, try to find a way to build a sense of what we call agency in other areas of your life, meaning you do something and feel good about it. It could be weeding a garden, it could be doing your job, it could be a small task, or any task that is simply unrelated to your narcissist. Just get something done. It may not fix the situation with the narcissist, but it may, at least for a short time, alleviate some of that sense of helplessness, even if it's just for a few minutes or an hour. Number 3, therapy. You know I'm always going to say therapy, just adjust, because that's how it's going to be in these videos, because it matters. Talk to someone. Understand the deeper roots of your helplessness. Find out how much of this is you not knowing there is another side of the box you can jump to. And also to avoid generalizing the experience with a few toxic relationships to all areas of your life. Helplessness is one of the most awful feelings in the world. And interestingly, Seligman's research, he went on to do it with many other species, from fish all the way up to people. And guess what? All of them learned helplessness. We living things actually can learn things quickly, but sadly, we can hold on to even the most dysfunctional lessons for too long. So in a sick kind of a way, many of you in narcissistic relationships, many of us, I should say, in narcissistic relationships, are sort of stuck in that harness with no button to press to stop those shocks. So I want you to sort of, again, move yourself over to that box where you can jump over to the other side, even if it's temporarily. And at a minimum, if you understand what's happening to you, even if it feels awful, just that simple sense of understanding can sometimes at least help you feel a little bit more control in the situation. It might be a disgusted control, but you might at least feel a little bit more empowered and capable of being able to address that situation simply by knowing what it is and saying, there's nothing I can do, so I'm not even going to try, and I'm going to try to focus on the areas of my life where I actually can get something done. Thank you again for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, give us that thumbs up, and please do subscribe and join this community. Bye.